In 1945, hardened Nazi prisoners of war arrived at American camps expecting interrogation, maybe torture, possibly execution. What they got instead was something so psychologically devastating that grown men, soldiers who'd survived the Eastern Front, broke down crying within days. Their captors? American women. And what these women did was so brilliant, so utterly unexpected, that it rewrote the rules of psychological warfare forever. I'm going to tell you a story that somehow got buried in history textbooks. A story about ordinary American women who became the most feared guards in the entire POW system. And here's the kicker: they never raised a hand in violence. Before we dive deep into this, hit that like button and subscribe, because you won't believe where this story goes. Let's set the scene. It's March 1945. The war in Europe is almost over, but America has a massive problem. We're holding over 370,000 German prisoners of war on American soil. That's more than the entire population of Cleveland at the time. These aren't just regular soldiers either. We're talking about hardcore SS officers, U-boat commanders, men who'd committed unspeakable atrocities, men who believed in Nazi ideology with religious fervor. The camps were scattered across the country, from Texas to Wisconsin, from New York to California. Most Americans had no idea these camps even existed in their own backyards. The government kept it quiet. Real quiet. Now here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. military had a problem within the problem. Male guards at these camps were stretched thin. Many were either too old or too young for combat duty. Some were recovering from injuries, and frankly, they weren't particularly good at their jobs. Fights broke out. Escape attempts happened weekly. Nazi prisoners literally ran underground schools teaching Hitler's ideology to new recruits behind barbed wire on American soil. The camps were becoming miniature Third Reichs. Someone had an idea. A crazy idea. What if we used WWII, Women's Army Corps members, as guards? Not just administrative staff, which was common, but actual guards with actual authority over Nazi prisoners. The military brass laughed it off at first. Can you imagine 1940s America, where women were supposed to be homemakers and factory workers at best, suddenly putting them in charge of Hitler's most devoted followers? It seemed absurd, dangerous even. But Camp Como in Como, Mississippi, decided to try something radical. Let me tell you about these women. They weren't Amazon warriors or tough-as-nails drill sergeants. They were secretaries, teachers, shopgirls, average American women who'd enlisted to serve their country. Most had never given an order to anyone in their lives. The oldest was maybe 30, the youngest, barely 21. The Nazi prisoners, when they first saw their new guards, literally laughed out loud. Here's what they didn't tell you in history class. These women understood something profound about the Nazi psyche that all the military strategists and intelligence officers had missed. The Nazis didn't just believe in male supremacy as theory. They'd built their entire worldview around it. The idea that women were subservient, inferior, existing only to produce children and serve men, this wasn't just policy, it was gospel. So imagine you're a German officer. You've spent years commanding troops, orchestrating military operations, believing you're part of the master race. And now you have to take orders from what you consider the lowest form of humanity. Not just Americans, not just enemies, but women. The humiliation was existential. But here's the thing. These women didn't fight fire with fire. They didn't try to be tough or masculine or prove they could match male guards in aggression. Instead, they did something infinitely more powerful. They were competent, unshakably, frustratingly, perfectly competent. Captain Mary Halloran, who oversaw the program, described it like this: "We didn't need to prove anything. We just needed to exist, to be good at our jobs, and let them reconcile that with everything they believed." The daily routine became torture for these prisoners. Every morning, women guards conducted roll call with crisp precision. Every inspection was thorough and professional. Every order was clear and followed military protocol to the letter. The women didn't yell. They didn't threaten. They simply expected compliance. And when they didn't get it, they wrote reports that went straight to the camp commander. The prisoners couldn't process it. Their entire worldview said these women should fail, should break down, should prove their inferiority. But day after day, week after week, these American women showed up and did their jobs with such casual competence that it broke something fundamental in the Nazi prisoners' understanding of reality. Let me give you a specific example. There was a prisoner named Hans Müller, not his real name, but his story is documented in camp records. Müller was a former SS officer, 34 years old, decorated multiple times for valor on the Eastern Front. Hard as nails. True believer in the cause. He refused to follow an order from a female guard. Simple stuff. Returned to his barracks at lights out. He stood there, arms crossed, smirking. The other prisoners watched to see what would happen. The guard, a 23-year-old named Dorothy from Wisconsin, didn't raise her voice. She pulled out her notepad, wrote down the infraction, looked him straight in the eye and said, "This goes to the commander. Your choice." Muller stood there for another minute. Then he went to his barracks. Within a week, he'd stopped resisting. Within a month, former prisoners reported that he was one of the most compliant inmates in the entire camp. What broke him? Not violence, not intimidation. Just the daily, grinding realization that everything he believed was a lie. But here's where the story takes an even more incredible turn. The women guards started noticing something. The prisoners under their watch were changing faster than prisoners anywhere else in the POW system. They were more cooperative, less likely to escape. And here's the really wild part. They were actually beginning to question Nazi ideology. The military took notice. By late 1945, they started expanding the program. More camps, more female guards, and the results were consistently the same. Prisoners under female supervision showed dramatically higher rates of re-education success. That's the military term for getting Nazis to renounce their beliefs. Why did this work so effectively? The psychologists who studied this later figured out something brilliant. When you challenge someone's beliefs through argument or force, they dig in deeper. It's human nature. But when reality itself contradicts their worldview every single day, when they can't escape the evidence right in front of them, cognitive dissonance does the work for you. These Nazi prisoners couldn't maintain the mental gymnastics required to believe women were inferior while simultaneously taking orders from them, respecting their authority, and watching them succeed at every task. Something had to give. And eventually, it was the ideology that cracked. There's a letter in the National Archives. I've seen it myself. Written by a German prisoner to his wife back home in 1946. He describes his American captors, these female guards, with something close to awe. He writes, "I don't understand how we believed what we believed. These women have shown me I was living in a fantasy." Now, let me be clear about something. This wasn't easy for these women. Not by a long shot. They faced constant harassment, verbal abuse, sexual comments, threats. Some prisoners tried to intimidate them, to break their composure. Male guards at the camps often resented them, didn't take them seriously, sometimes actively undermined their authority. But the women had each other. They formed tight bonds, supported each other through the worst of it. And they had something else. They believed in what they were doing. Not just guard duty, but proving something bigger. Proving that women deserved respect, deserved authority, deserved to be taken seriously. One of the guards, Lieutenant Ruth Briggs, said in an interview decades later, "We knew we were representing all American women. Every time we put on that uniform, every time we gave an order, we were fighting two wars, the one overseas and the one at home for recognition." The success of the program had ripples that went far beyond the camps. Military leaders who'd opposed women in active duty roles suddenly had concrete evidence that women could handle positions of authority, could handle dangerous situations, could succeed where men had struggled. It planted seeds that wouldn't fully bloom for decades, the eventual integration of women into all military roles, the breaking down of gender barriers across American society. These women at Nazi POW camps were proving something that would take another generation to fully accept. But here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. What happened to these women after the war? Most went back to civilian life, back to being secretaries, teachers, housewives. Many of them never told their stories. There were no parades, no medals, no recognition. For decades, this chapter of history was barely a footnote. Why? Partly because the POW camps themselves were kept quiet. The government didn't exactly advertise that we'd housed hundreds of thousands of Nazi prisoners on American soil. Partly because women's contributions to the war effort in general got minimized or erased once the men came home. But mostly because what these women accomplished didn't fit the narrative. It wasn't dramatic enough for Hollywood. No explosions, no battles, no heroic last stands. Just daily, patient, persistent competence in the face of hatred and disbelief. Yet in many ways, what they did was more revolutionary than combat. They proved that the most powerful weapon isn't violence. It's forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Think about the psychological brilliance of this approach. The U.S. military spent millions on interrogation techniques, re-education programs, propaganda films shown to prisoners. Most of it failed or had minimal impact. But put Nazi prisoners under the authority of competent women? Their entire worldview imploded from within. By 1946, as the camps started closing and prisoners were sent back to Germany, the Women Guards program was quietly discontinued. The WWII went back to traditional support roles. The experiment ended not because it failed, but because the war was over, and the military returned to its old ways. But the prisoners who went home remembered. Some of them became leaders in rebuilding post-war Germany. Some of them became vocal anti-fascists. And while we can't draw a direct line, it's worth noting that West Germany became one of the strongest democracies in Europe, with some of the most progressive gender equality laws for its time. Did those female guards at American POW camps play a role in that? We'll never know for sure. But the prisoners they supervised, the ones who learned that their beliefs about superiority were fundamentally wrong, they carried those lessons home. Here's what makes this story so relevant today. We live in a time where hatred and extremism feel like they're growing, where people retreat into ideological bubbles, where changing minds seems impossible. This story reminds us that transformation doesn't always come from argument or force. Sometimes it comes from simply, persistently, being undeniably competent in the face of those who say you can't be. Those American women in 1945 didn't set out to change the world. They just showed up, did their jobs, and refused to accept that anyone's prejudice determined their worth. And in doing so, they broke something in the psyche of men who'd been trained to hate, trained to kill, trained to believe in their own supremacy. If that's not a superpower, I don't know what is. The next time someone tells you that changing deeply held beliefs is impossible, that extremists can't be reached, that hatred is too entrenched to overcome, Remember the women guards of American POW camps. Remember that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply existing, competently and unapologetically in spaces where others insist you don't belong. These women didn't just guard prisoners, they guarded something bigger. The idea that human dignity isn't determined by gender, race, or nationality. That competence and character matter more than ideology. That even the most hardened hearts can crack when faced with undeniable truth. And maybe that's the most unbelievable part of all. Not that it happened, but that we almost forgot it did.